not comfortable with your name or anything, or image or anything being up, I guess you can log in under a different name on Teams, or just put your phone number in or something like that. So any questions? Does anybody have any questions or concerns about that? Okay, I should add, we'll post it on our YouTube video, we have a State Water Board YouTube site for California Water Monitoring Council, so we'll post it up there for folks that aren't able to attend today. So we have quite a few folks on the line today, so I don't know so much it's going to make sense to go through roll call. We'll probably just go ahead and skip that, and because I think we have over, looks like almost 80 participants. Most people's info is up on the side, so if you're curious who's here, you can look there. Please make sure before you start talking, if you would like to discuss something, that you say what your name is, so everybody knows who's who. So our first item is action items, and Mina, I don't know if we had any action items from our last meeting. It looks like I had two. So we did send the conservation flyer out. I believe I sent that out to the working group. If you're still looking to get a copy of that, we do have it posted online. I'd be more than happy to share with you the link to that. If anybody's still interested, just reach out to me. And then yeah, we're still coordinating with with the Nature Conservancy on setting up a meeting to discuss implementation of CEFF. So next item is, we might as well get right on into the presentation of the California Environmental Flows Framework, where we're at. At this time, we are planning to, we have a final draft of the flows framework, and we're planning to release that to this work group, everybody on this that participates in this work group, for their review and comment. Hopefully Friday is our target right now that we're planning for. So what we'll do here is provide a little overview of any updates and what's in the document, and then next steps. So Eric, I'm not sure if you were going to be the lead on this one for the tech team.
Yes, I am. And so let me go ahead and share my screen, and then you can tell me if it's working or not. Let me get back to the beginning. Was that the presenter view or the full screen view when I brought it up?
Full screen view.
Okay, so you see the whole screen, not the speaker notes version.
Correct.
Okay, great. And I can turn my camera on. All right, thanks, Dan. I'm going to go through a fairly short, maybe about 15-minute presentation on the Environmental Flows Framework. I know many of you on the call have been a part of this process for several years now. And so the goal of this is to just provide an overview, not get into extensive detail, just highlight the revisions that have been made in the most recent set of edits. However, I know the chat is active and there are a lot of people on the phone, so feel free to chat questions, and then we'll have time after the brief presentation for additional discussion. If there's things I glossed over that you want to ask more questions or have a more detailed discussion about. So again, the goal of this presentation is to provide an update, and then at the end, Dan will talk a little bit more about the process moving forward in terms of review of the document. So just to remind folks, the framework document, which will be imminently released, is a product of the technical team that's been working for several years to support this group, the State Interagency Environmental Flows Work Group, in developing sort of the technical process for the Environmental Flows Framework. So I just want to acknowledge all the members of the technical team who've worked over the last several years to produce this. So just as a reminder for folks, the Environmental Flows Framework, it's a technical guidance document to help managers efficiently develop scientifically defensible environmental flow recommendations. Some of the key points to remember about this is not intended to be a prescriptive or preemptive of any agency programs or policies. It doesn't replace any of the things that individual programs do in their day-to-day work. It's really designed to sort of be a consistent set of consistent technical approach that can be used across many different programs as appropriate. One of the strengths, I think, of this is that there was a lot of input and collaboration from multiple agencies and entities, including many of you on the phone today, to help us develop this. So hopefully it represents a consensus viewpoint on a technical approach to develop environmental flow recommendations. The key elements are that a large part of the document focuses on the development of ecological flow criteria, which are quantifiable metrics that describe ranges of flows that must be maintained to support natural functions of a healthy ecosystem. So it's really about the ecology. And just to remind folks, it's not species specific. It's not geared towards a specific fish or amphibian or any species, but it's really designed to be more holistic and account for flows necessary to maintain the overall healthy function of the entire ecosystem. And it's based on the functional flows framework, which looks at 5 components over the annual hydrograph. We won't be going through the details of the functional flows metrics themselves in this presentation because we've covered that extensively in previous presentations. The last part of the framework is has a process for developing environmental flow recommendations. And this is the part of the process where you take into account human uses and other sort of non-ecological objectives that might necessitate you to consider how to adjust some of the flow criteria to account for some of those other non-ecological needs or objectives. And that's the last part of the framework. It's important to stress that it's a 12-step process organized into 3 sections, which I'll present some details on each of the sections. But it really is designed to be sort of a continuous process where you sort of work through all 12 steps in sequence to try to go through all the elements of the entire framework. So since we last met about a quarter ago, the tech team has been busy sort of making some final updates to the framework document. It's important to understand that the approach itself, the underlying technical approach, the underlying science, and the underlying structure of the approach, that's been previously agreed upon by this group, and that has not fundamentally changed. So there aren't any changes to the approach that's being used in the framework. Really, most of the changes were made to improve the clarity and simplify the document. We had a lot of feedbacks from some of the initial review that there was too much jargon, there was some inconsistent use of terms, and that it was a little bit too complicated in terms of following through from start. Spent a lot of time really working on the clarity and simplifying the approach. There isn't any sort of fundamental technical changes to it. We've also tried to provide some more consistent examples throughout the document where we take a single example and sort of work through the entire 12-step process using a single example, as well as some worksheets that we've created to help, again, from a user perspective, sort of understand how to step through the process. When you are complete, after you go through all 12 steps in CEFF, what you wind up with in terms of what a stakeholder will get from this is you get the guidance on how to go through those 12 steps. You wind up being able to produce ecological flow criteria for your location of interest or your multiple locations of interest. You, through a stakeholder process, can develop environmental flow recommendations that take into account some of the non-ecological needs of the system, and as well as some recommended mitigation measures that might be considered to offset if you have an ecological flow criteria and you adjust that to an environmental flow recommendation because of some other human needs. What are some mitigation measures you might consider to offset some of the potential loss in ecological function that might occur by adjusting those criteria to produce those more those more balanced recommendations. And then there's a section that talks about some thoughts in a general sense on implementation, monitoring, and adaptive management. There's also a series of online tools, which I'll touch on in the presentation, to help you calculate the functional flow metrics, to understand how to develop the natural flow expectations associated with different stream reaches, and there's an information repository on the CEFF website. So this is one of our newer figures, and it's designed to simply sort of lay out the overview of the 3 sections. So we've renamed these section A, B, and C, and within each section are a series of steps. So the letters refer to the sections and the numbers refer to the steps. And I'll walk through each of those. On this slide, what I want to stress is that sections A and B are really sort of the core of the science side, and that's where you develop your ecological flow criteria through steps 1 through 7, which includes sections A and B. And then section C, that's more of the kind of socio-political implementation piece, and that's where the part that's less prescriptive in section C, and that's where you offer some general ideas about how to adjust or how to think about the ecological flow criteria in light of some of the non-ecological or human use needs. So I'm going to just briefly walk through each of the 3 sections in a couple of slides and explore them in a little more detail, and then we'll have some more time for questions. So again, section A is where you begin to identify the ecological flow criteria based on the natural functional flows approach, which we've discussed. I hear some background noise, so maybe if you can mute your phone, your microphone if you're on the phone. So the key question that in section A that we're trying to answer is, what are the natural functional flows at your location of interest, and what are the corresponding ecological flow criteria associated with that? And that's where we've created some online tools like the Natural Flows database, which can allow you to easily get the natural functional flows based on the statewide model that the technical team has developed. So at the end of section A, you have a set of ecological flow criteria for your location of interest, which could be a river, or potential reaches, or a watershed, and those are based on the predictions of the natural ranges of the flow metrics for each of those 5 functional flow components and the metrics that make up each of those components. So just to unpackage that a little bit, there's 4 major steps in section A. So the first starts with defining your ecological management goals and understanding what you're trying to accomplish in the system as a whole. Then going to the natural flows database and obtaining the natural ranges of flow metrics for each of the functional flow metrics within the 5 functional flow components, so you can get those ranges using the online tool. And then in step 3, you look at, are there other non-flow factors, such as something about the morphology of the channel, the hydraulics of the channel, maybe some elements that are affecting temperature. So other things that are not sort of directly flow related that may affect the ability of those natural ranges to achieve your management goals. So for example, if you have a channel that is potentially incised and somewhat disconnected from the floodplain, the natural functional flows that you get from the database may not be wholly on themselves able to achieve your ecological management goals, given the fact that the channel has been geomorphically altered. So you want to evaluate those types of factors and considerations in step 3. And then in step 4, you identify which of the flow criteria don't require additional consideration. So if you have the different criteria, many we think will be fine as is based on the natural functional flows metrics that you obtain from the website. But some of them, if there are these other non-flow factors, may need some additional consideration. And it's that subset of metrics that may need some additional consideration that get carried over into section B. So at the end of the section A, what you have is you have a set of ecological flow criteria, and you've identified the subset of those that require some additional consideration for these non-flow factors. And that's what happens in section B. So the last thing on section A is we've created a worksheet, and this is intended to sort of step you through each of those 4 steps in a very sequential manner. So we have a worksheet, we have a blank with some examples, and then we have an example and document of this worksheet that's been sort of fully filled out for our example case that we carry through the document. So that's intended just to provide some tools for the users to step through the first 4 steps of CEFF. Then as you transition to section B, again, for that subset of those criteria that require additional consideration, this is the section of CEFF where you actually take into account some of those other factors that you might need to adjust the ecological flow criteria to account for those non-flow factors, such as things like altered channel morphology. So the key questions for the applicable metric criteria are, how do you use additional information or models or things like that to develop ecological flow criteria that accommodate some of those other constraints in the system? And so at the end of this section, what you have is you have a complete set of ecological flow criteria, which includes the set that were sort of fine as is at the end of section A, and then the subset of those that needed to be adjusted based on these non-flow factors. So that at the end of section B, you sort of have a complete set of your ecological flow criteria. So just to unpackage section B a little bit, the first step 5, which is the first step in section B, is where you for that subset of the criteria that need additional consideration, you develop some detailed conceptual models that relate the flow components to the ecological management goals and identify some of those other considerations that need to be accounted for. And I'll show you an example of this in the next slide. Step 6 is where you go ahead and quantify those relationships using models or empirical relationships, things along those lines. And then in step 7 is where you then go ahead and define the ecological flow criteria for those functional flow components, accounting for those other considerations, such as water quality or physical habitat, things like that. And so at the outcome of this section B, as I previously mentioned, you have the set of criteria that you carried over from step 4, the subset of criteria that you refined through section B, and you put those together and you have your final set of ecological flow criteria at the end of section B. So here's an example. In this example, what you can see on the left, I have the general conceptual model. So this is a general conceptual model where you have your 5 functional flow components in the blue box on the top. And in this example, we've highlighted dry season base flow as the component that needs some additional consideration given these non-flow factors. And then on the right is an example of a specific conceptual model. So in this example, under dry season base flow, you might do some additional analysis to account for water quality, in this case temperature, or some of the physical habitat of the system, depth and velocity. And so you can use some additional models or empirical relationships to account for those other factors, and then at the end, and how that affects sort of the ecological goal that you're specifically considering. Here, for example, is juvenile growth and survival, and then use that to come up with a refined or a new ecological flow criteria for the dry season base flow in this example that accounts for the specific needs of your system. All right, so then as we transition to section C, now we have our full set of ecological flow criteria. And again, section C is where you transition more into the considerations of non-ecological management goals, or some of the more human-focused management goals, and you use those to develop your environmental flow recommendations. So in this section, the key question you're trying to answer is, how do you reconcile the ecological flow criteria that you have at the end of section B with the non-ecological management objectives of your system to create these more balanced environmental flow recommendations? So section C again provides its guidance. It's much less sort of detailed because we know this is very site specific and location specific, and has to be fully informed by the stakeholder process. So it's not possible to provide quite as much structure in section C, and it's something that has a much more of a general flavor to it. So it has the flexibility to be adapted and applied as appropriate for your location. And so at the end of that, you have this final set of environmental flow recommendations. One thing I wanted to note for those of you who've been following the process along is that in previous versions of CEFF, the assessment of flow alteration used to be in section A, and that's now been moved to section C. So it's the same general approach. It's just now we felt it made more sense to do this during this section C than section A. And I'll show you that on the next slide. So these are section C unpackaged a little bit. So again, we start with identifying the management objectives, and here's where you're thinking about not only the ecological, but the more human-focused management objectives. Step 9 is here. Now you assess the flow alteration. So you have your set of ecological criteria. Now you're looking at what the current conditions are within your location of interest and identifying which components are altered based on the current conditions. Then to step 10, you can think about management scenarios and trade-offs. And so here's where you start to think about, can we do something differently in the system if there are areas where flows are altered and they're not currently meeting the ecological flow criteria? What are my options in terms of maybe doing something different in the system, some sort of restoration action, some sort of modification, and then if you can't do those sort of modifications to get to your ecological flow criteria, what are some of the trade-offs that you might have to consider if you are going to decide to manage flows in a way that is different than the ecological flow criteria? And those trade-offs might include other types of mitigation measures to offset potential effects to the functions of the system. So after that whole process, and that's a very stakeholder-driven process, it'll involve lots of different agency programs and policies and stakeholder needs and local goals and interests. So at the end of that, you wind up with a set of environmental flow recommendations that account for both the ecological needs and the non-ecological needs of the system. And then finally, in step 12 is the implementation plan, where you think about things like monitoring and adaptive management and all the things that are necessary to ensure that the system is managed into the future. And so at the outcome, you have your environmental flow recommendations and your implementation plan. So again, this section C is much more general because it sort of has to be, as I said. And so the important point is this is a very iterative process. And so we have some examples in there from the structured decision-making literature that sort of illustrate this iterative process that you go through in order to kind of incrementally refine what you decide to do in terms of flow management to hopefully account as much as possible for the ecological needs of the system while still accounting for the non-ecological needs of the system. So at the end, what you wind up with is a table like this. This is an example of the document. And so for each of the 5 functional flow components, we have the different metrics and the characteristics that go into those components. And you have sort of in the third column over from the left, you have your ecological flow criteria. So this is what you get at the end of section B. You have your ecological flow criteria. And then in the far right column, you have your environmental flow recommendations. And so in some cases, these environmental flow recommendations will be the same as the ecological flow criteria because perhaps you've identified things you can do in the system in terms of from a management perspective to manage flows in order to achieve the ecological flow criteria. That's sort of in a sense from an ecological perspective, the goal would be to have as many of your environmental flow recommendations be the same as your ecological flow criteria, because then you're fully supporting the functions of the system, which is what we're trying to accomplish. But recognizing that there are some cases where that may not be possible. In some instances, you may have an environmental flow recommendation that's different from your ecological flow criteria to account for some of those human needs. And that's where you would identify potentially some mitigation measures that you might use to offset some of the potential loss in ecological function. And then all of that rolls into your implementation plan. So that's kind of a very sort of high level view of the process. Again, there's a lot of details in the document, which Dan will talk about that shortly in terms of the review of that document. But we just wanted to walk through that. And again, the general approach hasn't changed since the last time you've seen it. We just think that now the current version of the document should be easier to understand, easier to follow, and simpler overall. So just a few resources as I wrap up. All of the draft framework document will be posted shortly on the California Environmental Flows Framework website. So if you go to the website, and again, Dan will talk about some of the schedules on the last slide, and you go to the framework, you'll see on the right, it has the framework, and you'll be able to download the guidance document for review, as you can see in the bottom of the screen there, as well as the long list of appendices that provide a lot of the more detailed science foundation behind the document. So the document is relatively short, but there's a very long list of appendices that you can look at if you want to get into a lot more of the technical details. And again, in terms of the review process, the document will be live on the website later this week or by November 13th. We're requesting comments in about a little bit more than a month. And in reviewing this, in order to sort of facilitate the review process, we've created a little online form. There's a web link there. It'll also be available through the website. And so what you can, the online form is designed to allow you to identify a specific section of the document and then provide comments that are keyed back to a specific section of the document. So it'll be a way to help us receive those comments and keep them organized in a way so that we can best address them. And so in doing this, we want you to sort of also think about, because it's important to understand that CEFF is a living document. We expect it to continue to evolve over time as people use it. And so in reviewing it, think about, how can the framework be best used to address your needs in your programs or in your locations or under the management objectives that you're working to accomplish, and where are there opportunities where we can work with you in the future for additional interaction and engagement to help refine the process, because we understand that this will need to continue to be refined and clarified and improved through implementation. So this is just a little screenshot of what that looks like. So if you go to this link, it'll bring you up to a little table that's connected to our Google Drive. And so this will allow us, again, it's got some drop-down lists for a category of comment, line number, figure number, table number, etc. You don't have to fill in all the rows, all the columns necessarily, but then a column for your comment. And then this, again, it's just a way for you to keep track of your comments, and then through the add file button on the bottom, upload it, and then we can keep track of that. The last piece that I wanted to mention is that we also understand that as people will start to use CEFF, there will be lots of practical implementation questions. And so we're developing a preliminary set of FAQs, or frequently asked questions, regarding implementation of CEFF. And so we are working on a process for addressing those questions. On the slide, these are some example questions that we've received to date. I won't read through all of them, but this is the type of questions that we're starting to hear from people who are starting to use this through some of our initial pilot studies. And so what we like is we've created another form that you can use, a web form that you can use to post questions about CEFF implementation. And we're going to begin to compile these questions and develop a frequently asked questions document so that we can provide answers to these questions as they arise. So again, as I had mentioned, CEFF is a living document. It's a product of this work group. So it's a joint product of the entire work group, even though it's funded primarily by the State Water Board. This is definitely a product of the work group, and so it's important to think of it as a living document and continue to explore how CEFF can coordinate with existing programs. So we understand that there are lots of discussions going on now, and there will continue to be lots of discussions about specific areas of the state, specific programs, specific new regulatory programs that are coming out, or specific types of stream settings. And so there's, as I mentioned, a lot of interest over time, I think, in expanding Section C and providing maybe some more details and some more examples with input from other groups and stakeholders. So as CEFF begins to be implemented, we're hoping that we can work with you to learn from your experiences in implementing CEFF and feed that back into the document to provide some more detail, specificity, or examples, particularly in Section C under the implementation piece. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Dan to talk a little bit more about the review process moving forward.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so as Eric mentioned, we're going to go ahead and host that this Friday. and for a 30-day, a little bit over a 30-day comment period. So we look forward to getting those comments back from everybody. And then once we get the comments back, we'll work through the document and make any updates as needed, and have a final probably early next year. It's looking like with Christmas in there and stuff. Once we have the final document, as Eric mentioned, it's a product of the working group. So we'll work with the Water Quality Monitoring Council, the oversight group, to see how they want us to roll that out if it's more of a larger release. As far as moving forward, as Eric mentioned, there's some other items that we may want to add or to address in the future, and we can start to evaluate what some of those might be to kind of take those next steps. One thing I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows and understands is that the Section C for the development of the environmental flow recommendations, that process is not intended to circumvent or shortcut any of the State Water Board standard processes. We wanted to put that in. It's not for, as we mentioned, it's not really for the regulatory application of Section C. It's more looking at local decisions and local, like a local cooperative agreement on how best to manage flows in the system, or voluntary agreements and that type of effort. And I think that's pretty much it for the next steps. Does anyone have any questions? It might be easiest if you can type your question in chat or raise your hand so we don't talk on each other. I'm not seeing any questions. We can, I'll give it another minute or two, and then we can circle back on any questions that people might have after our next agenda item. So it looks like we got some questions in. Are there any next step actions proposed to validate ecological flow criteria? And that's from Darren. Darren, did you want to expand on that at all?
Well, I mean, that's the basic question, just whether or not, there are any proposed watershed pilot programs where you're going to look at the outcome of the ecological flow criteria in terms of flow ecology relationships that may be available, or to determine their effectiveness in protecting our resources.
Yeah, so Darren, this is Eric. I'll start, and I'll let other members of the tech team jump in. So there are, as I know, I think you're aware, a number of pilot projects going on in different parts of the state to do sort of exactly that, right? So there's a number of watersheds in the state where we're, in a sense, test driving the CEFF approach, and that's partly to do some of the validation, as you had mentioned, and also partly to provide some examples. Things are always more tangible when you can see how they actually play out in the real world. So it's kind of a dual purpose to provide a little more of a specific view of how CEFF works, as well as some of the validation. I mean, ultimately, I think the ultimate validation obviously will occur over time as some of these watershed programs go into implementation. Hopefully through continued monitoring and assessment, we can continue to follow the system to better understand how effective the decisions we've made regarding flow criteria have been at actually protecting the system, right? That'll be borne out through monitoring over time. But I'll stop there and see if others from the work group want to weigh in, or if you have a follow-up question.
Well, I guess Just one follow-up question then, are those pilot watersheds or programs, will they be part of the documentation or just kind of future reports that, you know, acknowledge their association with the CEFF approach?
Yeah, we have one of the pilot projects is already you know, included in the appendices, and so and then the others are sort of still in progress. So you know, there will be one in the current set of appendices, and then the others and we have sort of a standard format we've developed for documenting these pilots. And so as the other pilot projects get a little further along, we'll write those up and post those as well as they become available. So there's sort of one that's, you know, that's further along that will already be available, and the others will come along as they're wrapped up.
Hi, Eric. This is Sam. You know, I also think that validation. I think also consider that some of the ecological criteria proposed is just a starting point, and at any point it can be we can have additional considerations. So it is a framework that include the feedback from other sources. So that's something that I want to highlight. The second one is that yeah, because this is a living document, I think as cases are added or developed, I think it will be good to report it back.
Yeah, and that's right. We're hoping that as you all and others begin to implement CEFF, we'd love to receive feedback, example products, all of that. The more that we can receive that and make that more broadly available to the user community as a whole statewide, I think the better we'll all be.
Okay, so we got a couple more questions in chat. One, will the meeting be recorded? And yes, it will be made available, or will the meeting recording be made available? And it will be posted on the Monitoring Council's YouTube webpage, and we'll send a link out to that to everybody once we get it up there. And the next one looks like it's a little bit more of an action item. Mina, if you want to take down that for a future meeting topic of presentations on pilot projects at a future meeting. Request to see some of those presentations. And then the next question is, does the guidance specify recommended tools or analytical approaches in section B, step 6?
Yeah, this is Julie. I can take that question. So in section B, the approach that we took is to say that the method that you use to come up with flows depends on what your ecological objective is and your conceptual model. So if you work through the steps, you have already identified a functional flow component that you think is not achieving the ecological functions because of some non-flow issue in the watershed. So the example that we provide for a hypothetical stream is that there was widening of the stream channel, and so the flow in the dry season no longer provides appropriate depth and velocity and temperature for rearing habitat and survival of juvenile salmon. So in that case, you would construct a conceptual model that said your outcome that you care about relates to the juvenile life cycle of salmon. And there's a kind of a habitat pathway and a temperature pathway. And so for that specific case, you would need to do some hydraulic modeling and some temperature modeling, and then ultimately relate the temperature to juvenile salmon survival and relate the habitat to habitat availability and then growth and survival of your your ecological target, the salmon in that case. So we don't say that you should always go out and do a specific type of study. It really depends on that function that's not being met and the conceptual model that you build to then achieve that outcome that you're looking for.
And I think following on that question, yes, there are also mentioned some in the appendices. There are mentioned some of the tools or the specific databases or data sets that you may also take a look up for some of those, or to complete your conceptual model.
Okay, so the next question is, which pilot project is included in the appendix?
So as I am looking at the appendices, I don't think we include a pilot project. We include the metadata, how to document the metadata for the case of studies, but we're currently working on some. I might be wrong. Eric, Sarah, I think we didn't include any example, did we? Well, also the rest of the team.
No, I'm aware that we did not. We will have examples come out as they're completed. For example, South Fork eel, Sam, like you're talking about. And then Eric mentioned the couple case studies that are down in Southern California. And then there are additional pilot studies that have just started, but those probably won't be out for another year or two, would be my guess.
And perhaps just to be clear, we're going to have a case study metadata documentation templates, which I think that's something that perhaps Eric was referring to that one.
Yeah, to help people document, and some of the Southern California case studies will probably be available in the sort of mid 2021 timeframe.
Okay, so it looks like we have one more question at this point. Could you clarify or explain natural and the natural functional flows? Is it the flows for natural functions or natural flows?
I can take that one. This is Ted Grantham was involved in that modeling component. So what we mean by natural functional flows are we develop these models that predict specific flow, the values of specific flow metrics. And those are the values that we'd expect to see in the absence of human activities, both water management activities as well as land use activities. So this is a bit different than unimpaired flows that are often used and or referred to in the sort of DWR or water management contexts. And so we basically develop these models that predict what we think flows, these different flow components would look like in the absence of human alteration. And when we have contexts in which we don't have, say, geomorphic alteration or temperature alteration, we would expect those natural ranges of flows to support natural functions. And that's sort of the hypothesis that guides this section A in developing ecological flow criteria. So we're assuming that when if our watersheds or streams are relatively intact or unaffected by geomorphic alteration or invasive species or so forth, that we'd expect those functions to be supported by the natural range of these functional flow components. And then through section B, as Julie described, in circumstances where that's not the case, and we do have some forms of impairment, then we need to do more detailed studies to figure out what the appropriate range of flows for those functional flow metrics would be to sustain those functions.
And just to add a little bit there, so the models that Ted is referring, and they were, those predictive models, they use data for a so-called natural or less impaired 223 stream flow gauges throughout the state. And those were have been documented and peer reviewed and analyzed for that. So the underlying data, it's been verified. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thanks, Sam.
Hi, this is Watson. I just asked that question. So what you said, Ted, based on your answer, is that natural functional flow, meaning the functional flows under natural circumstances or natural conditions. And that is a slightly different definition that's being proposed by the Sarah Yanell's 2015 paper of functional flows. Am I correct in the sort of understanding of it?
So, the definition of functional flows is that there are, particular aspects of the flow regime that are, disproportionately important in sustaining, geomorphic, biological and chemical functions. And so basically the concept of functional flow simply states that there are these certain aspects of the flow regime that are important for supporting ecosystem health. The Yarnell paper doesn't prescribe, particular values of those functional flows to sustain the functions, and that's what we're trying to do through this CEFF process, is actually determine what the range of values for each of these flow components should be to support those functions. And so in this first section of CEFF, in section A, we again hypothesize that the natural range of those different flow components are going to be adequate for sustaining these various ecosystem functions. And then in circumstances where that's not the case, we provide guidance on how to refine those ranges using a different set of tools. Did that clarify your question?
In a way.
Yeah. So I guess the important thing, the Yarnell paper and that concept of functional flows just identifies the fact that there are certain components that are important, but it doesn't actually prescribe, particular values that need to be achieved or maintained to support those functions. And that's what we're doing through this process.
Yeah, but I guess the terminology adding the natural functional flows is sort of I guess that's my initial point of confusion in a way, or so here's my question. When you say natural functional flows, we are trying to I understand the functional flows concept, but I think the original idea was to trigger those natural ecological functions in the stream and river systems. Then in the current state of land use or human use and everything else, then you'd like to provide a certain level of flows to trigger or maintain the certain functions. Now, when you said the natural functional flows, does that mean actually the functional flows under the sort of a natural conditions? I guess that's what you sort of implied earlier on your answer, Ted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's where sort of a slight difference is of understanding of when you say purely the functional flows. As far as my understanding goes, it's those flows that could trigger or initiate or provide certain or activate certain functions in the river system or stream systems. Now, when you say, I understand obviously when you say when you actually add the natural wording into the functional flows as making it natural functional flows, it's actually the functional flows under the sort of a natural landscape conditions, I guess. But obviously your answer clarifies my sort of confusion there, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think the way you just explained it is right. I think what's important to note is that the entire sort of CEFF process is sort of built upon this concept of functional flows, and it's only in this first section of CEFF, this section A, in which we use the idea of natural functional flows to guide the development of ecological flow criteria, and through the second section is where we would expect you know, the ecological flow criteria, so our estimates of the flow values needed to support ecosystem functions to deviate potentially from those natural expectations.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, the next question is, it seems like section C will necessarily undermine to some degree the flow recommendations arrived at in section B. Given that, it seems like it would be useful to have a section to predict consequences of failing to meet the section B flows so that a trial and error approach can be undertaken. Will there be something like that?
Yeah, hi, this is Eric. I can touch on that. So yeah, so Dave, that's exactly right. I touched on this briefly in the presentation, but what you lay out is exactly, again, in a not very prescriptive way, but the idea in section C is if there is an instance where after you've looked at the alteration in the system, so you understand how, you know, where and how you're not meeting the current criteria based on the natural functional flows that Ted was just talking about, are there opportunities to do things from a management perspective to get back closer to or within the ranges of the natural functional flows? If there aren't, or you make the decision from a management perspective, you make the decision that we're going to manage the system with different types of flows or different levels of flow in order to accommodate some of the non-ecological needs, and that's the decision that is made by either the agency or the stakeholder group, then there's a process in there that asks you to identify the consequences of that decision in terms of potential loss of ecological function, and to also identify potential mitigation measures that could be implemented to attempt to offset that loss of ecological function. So if that decision is made that because of other considerations, you're going to sort of deviate from the ecological flow criteria when you set the final flow recommendations, you have to also understand what the consequences of that decision are and what opportunities you might have to offset those potential adverse effects.
Hey, any other questions on this item? Okay, I'm seeing none, so we'll go ahead and move on to the overview of Senate Bill 19, the Stream Gaging Plan. If you have any other questions that come into your minds as we go through this other presentation and stuff, feel free to type a message and we'll circle back after the presentation. And I'm the one that's going to present this, so let me just pull up my stuff on my end and I'll get going here. Okay, so next slide, please. Oh, and I apologize. I just saw on my cover slide I had the wrong the wrong title up there. So I'll have to fix that before I send it out. So wanted to provide a overview on the Senate Bill 19 Stream Gaging Plan effort, and so that this group, I feel like this is a good group to keep informed of what we're working on and where we are in the process, and you know, receive any comments or feedback from this group as they come up. So this presentation outline, I'll go over the background of Senate Bill 19, provide an overview of what we're working on, some components that are required to be in the plan, our next steps, timeline, and then some contact information. So why do we need more stream gauges in the stream gaging plan? It is the state's responsibility to manage and protect California's water while also protecting, restoring, and enhancing the natural and human environment. An effective stream gauge network is essential for effective water management. Almost 3/4, around 72% of California watersheds do not have a state or federally operated stream gauge, and the majority of those ungauged watersheds, approximately 85% of them, have surface water diversion. And as we learned in the more recent drought, the decommissioning of gauges and lack of gauges in priority watersheds caused significant data gaps that hamper our effective management of water resources. And that forces state agencies to spend extra resources on field investigations and other less accurate means to obtain the needed data to make sure that we're protecting senior water rights as well as ecosystems for ecosystem management and as well as flood control. Next slide. So an overview, it was chapter 361 of statutes of 2019, which was Senate Bill 19, directs the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resource Control Board to develop a plan to deploy a network of stream gauges in consultation with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Conservation, and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and other interested stakeholders. And one item I want to highlight about this effort is that there is not funding included in this bill to install and actually operate the gauges. So it's just the plan. So next slide. So what is the stream gaging plan? Or what is our plan? And basically it's looking at what do we need to do, to look at where current gauges are, where historic gauges were, and determine where additional gauges are needed, or of those historic gauges, which ones should potentially be targeted for reactivation. And it also includes a determination of funding needs and opportunities for modernizing and deploying new gauges in different hydrologic regions in the state. And it also includes a look at our reference gauge locations and whether we need more reference gauges as well to help inform efforts like we just went over in CEFF. Next slide, please. So the State Water Board and Department of Water Resources will develop a ranking criteria. That's one of our steps that we'll do that will help prioritize gauge locations by taking into account the ability to modernize or reactivate stream gauges where lack of data contributes to conflicts in water management, or where water can be more effectively managed for multiple benefits, including water supply, flood, water quality, and ecosystem management. There is additional criteria for us to consider as well. These are items such as opportunities for local agencies to enter into cost share agreements, ease of integrating the stream gauge into the existing network, availability of historic gauge data, availability of temperature data, water quality and flow impacts related to cannabis cultivation, and integration with the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, as well as the ability to provide data to assist with groundwater management. Next slide. So development of the plan will include tasks related to researching the existing stream gauge network, different locations, costs, funding mechanisms, operational conditions, and other items like that. To identify gaps in the stream gauging network, consult with agencies, outreach with stakeholders, identify funding needs for future stream gauging, identification of partnership mechanisms and opportunities, and development of a draft, and then a final plan. Next slide. So timeline, it's a pretty quick turnaround on this. The effort July 1st, 2020, and that's when we started to meet with the agencies. And then we plan to release a draft plan for public comment somewhere in around February of 2022. And then we finalize the plan and submit it to the legislature by June 30th, 2022. So next slide, please. So wanted to provide you with some links here. Both the first one's to the web page. We have the Water Boards is hosting the web page for the effort. And we decided that as agencies that we would just have one location for everybody to go to. We also have an email address that you can see there, as well as an email subscription list. And to sign up for the email subscription list, you can go to either under the standard way of going to subscriptions and then water rights and collecting, or you can also go to the website itself and there's a little subscribe box that you can click and it will automatically sign you up from there. You'll still need to enter your email and stuff and confirm the subscription by responding to your email. You'll get a confirmation email. Next slide. So these are just the lead contacts for each agency. I'm currently the lead for the State Water Board. Department of Water Resources is Teresa Connor. California Department of Fish and Wildlife is Todd Carlin. And Department of Conservation is Mike Fuller. The Department of the Flood Control decided that they didn't want to participate in the core work group. This is our core work group, and they just wanted to participate in our technical advisory committee. So that's why you don't see them listed here. We have convened a technical advisory committee to help inform this effort. We just had our first meeting with them a few weeks ago. So, you know, as we move forward in the process, the idea is that the technical advisory committee will be working to reach out to constituents to help provide recommendations, you know, to receive recommendations and coordinate with the broader group. And then, of course, we'll have more of our standard communication through LIRIS emails and public meetings when they come up. And I believe that's my last slide. So do we have any questions? Question, will California require flow gauges on private land when necessary to protect public trust resources? Federal agencies are offering to not curtail diverters for endangered species flows when landowners allow flow gauges. My understanding is that you would still need the person that owns the private land would still need to enter into an agreement to allow the gauge to be operated there. At least that's my understanding of how it works now. So I'm not sure that we would outright be able to require somebody to give us the state trespass rights to put in a gauge. But that's something we can follow up. I think for a lot of our gauge sites, we typically can find a agreeable landowner or use a public location to put it in, such as by a bridge crossing, stream crossing, or something like that. And then I'm not entirely sure about the second piece. Conrad, did you want to elaborate on the second part of your question there?
On the second piece, I was thinking of safe harbor agreements going on in a couple parts of the state where it's seen as a big victory to get people to allow flow gauges when I didn't know if that was the position California was taking. I know on my required to instill flow gauges, and yet I see in other places it's seen as necessary to barter away ESA enforcement in order to get flow gauges on private land. And again, specifically through safe harbor negotiations.
Yeah, so the plan itself is actually just going to look at where there are data gaps and try to, for any of those items, flood control, water supply, ecosystem management, and based on those data gaps, look at where gauges could be put in. It's not going to determine exact gauge locations. So it will just be more of a general area somewhere in this general stream reach. That would be the second effort would look more at identifying actual specific locations once funding is provided.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is, what agency organizations, agencies are on the technical committee assisting with this plan development. So we have quite a few. We have the Association of California Water Agency, California State Association of Counties, Central Valley Flood Protection Board, the California Nevada River Forecast Center with NOAA, Northern California Water Association, and Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, United States Geological Survey, their Water Science Center, the California Water Commission, Internet of Water, and the California Water Data Consortium. Our effort was to try to put together a small team so it's manageable, but also make sure that there were agencies, organizations that were representative of a number of different categories to make sure that we had, you know, that vast background to provide input. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other comments at this time. So again,
I have a question. I'm on the phone. Oh. Sorry, I can't chat. I'm on the phone. Greg Reese with the Bay Institute. I just a question about the focus seems to be on putting in gauges, but it kind of started out with the premise that they're not state and federal. And there's a lot of local gauges out there, counties, irrigation districts, cities. Is there a plan for how to get those numerous gauges that are already existing, get their data into CDEC or some other more easily available source?
Yeah, that will be part of the effort as one of our recommendations. One of the components that we'll need to do regarding the existing gauge network is to try to outreach to potential folks that might have those gauges and find out where they are, so we can at least have them accounted for. And then we would probably be, we talked about making a recommendation and also, you know, looking at data quality control measures of getting some of that information up on something like CDEC and making it publicly available.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so I think we'll continue on with the agenda. If there's no other question, it looks like there's no questions at this time, and you know, feel free to add them. Oh wait, sorry, I saw one more just pop up. I'm new to this process. Can you describe how your efforts relate to official state flow related efforts? Also, the SGMA process is proceeding and many watersheds will be running headlong into the requirement of protecting environmental flows to some unspecific degree. Is there a plan to have this work product embraced somehow in the mini SGMA plans? I believe this comment's referring back to the CEFF, California Environmental Flows Framework. I don't know, does someone on the tech team want to handle that, or would you like me to?
Sounds like it might be good for you because it's more of an implementation question, Dan, it seems like.
Yeah, so, you know, the Water Board doesn't require a specific way to develop the information to inform the SGMA process and environmental flows. Part of what we're trying to do with this effort, though, is to, you know, through this working group, to have that outreach component so that it's more, so that the framework is embraced by others. It's structured to be set up that the more people apply it, the more data that's generated, the more valuable that information and data becomes. So we would certainly hope that they would use it. We wouldn't direct them to, though. And then, you know, one of the other things that we've talked about as one of the next steps is potentially looking at some of the figuring out how to identify some of those gaining, losing reaches to help inform some of their SGMA plans of where they need to target to protect environmental flows from groundwater. So one of the next steps for this group, if there's interest, is to kind of explore some of this some of the Sigma process and what we can do to help with the flows framework. Okay, so Mina, can you please pull the agenda back up? Okay, so it looks like we'll probably be finishing early today. Are there any updates that anybody has that they would like to share with the group?
Hey, Dan, this is Robert Holmes, CDFW.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I'd like to give an update. So we've made presentations at some of the previous CEFF meetings, and just for those that weren't there, we are using the CEFF tools in our flow analysis. We've developed a sort of a new approach in identifying flow criteria. It's called the watershed flow criteria reports. And so it's looking at flow criteria needs for aquatic ecosystem function on a watershed scale. And we've been using the CEFF tools, the functional flows and the natural flows, and incorporated that into those analysis. And so we've been doing that now for a couple of years now, and we've got a couple of reports online and some other ones that are being developed. And then more recently, we've been incorporating some of the functional flow metric predictions into our site-specific technical studies and looking at using our physical habitat, the hydraulic habitat models, and incorporating in the metric predictions with the habitat models. And I just say, from the initial, we're just skimming the surface now and just starting to look at those relationships. It's looking like, the results line up real nicely. And, that's what you would expect sort of with the hydrology-based tools, lining up with the physical habitat. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. And so there's going to be more to come on that, and we'll provide an update on that in the future. And then also wanted to let you all know that we have a new supervisor in the CDFW Flow Implementation Unit, and that's Brianna Drescher. And she'll be starting on December 2nd, and she'll be the supervisor over the Flow Implementation Unit and working with working with the State Board and others on the implementation of flow criteria and flow recommendations. So that's my update. If anybody had any questions, I can take any.
Thank you, Robert. Did anybody else have any updates they'd like to add? Okay, so we'll circle back to a couple more items in chat. One is for you, Robert. Can you share the link to the watershed flow criteria reports? Maybe put it in the chat over there, and people can get to it. And then the other comment question is, as part of the pilot project validation, would you be trying to compare the final CEFF recommendation hydrograph to the estimated unimpaired hydrograph to identify what parts of the natural unimpaired hydrograph are missing from the final recommendation? And I don't know, does anyone from the tech team want to take that one?
In one of the pilot projects, yes, we're doing that. Not necessarily to see what are missing or not, but just we're comparing them. And with other ways to not necessarily refine it, but modify it. Mm-hmm.
And this is Julie. I think the question So when we develop the 5 functional flow components, the hypothesis behind that is if you were to achieve those flow components, so you're kind of extracting that variability from the whole unimpaired hydrograph, that would be ecologically protective. So I think that you can go back and say, do a comparison of flow volumes, and then also ecological response, but I don't think that we would do a comparison of missing flow variability from the unimpaired hydrograph, because the whole theory of extracting those flow components is that those are the pieces that you would have to maintain.
Well, do we have I don't know if it's functioning yet, but the ability for people to upload their own gauge data and it will pull out the flow metrics for them as well?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's what I didn't understand about the question is, right, you can, with the calculator, you can run a time series of flow to say, to see what those flow metrics would be. But again, those are just pulling out the 5 functional flow components. So the problem with looking at unimpaired flow and comparing that to the flow components is that unimpaired flow is variable, right? So there's not like a particular piece that you would compare it to necessarily.
Julie, this is Sarah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I was just going to add that if you had the unimpaired, if you had a model that was predicting unimpaired flow for your location of interest, you could use those results and run it through the functional flow calculator to extract out, and you could then do a comparison to what your current hydrograph looks like, unimpaired hydrograph versus the natural flow hydrograph, and see if there's any significant differences between the two as part of your analysis.
Right. Yes, exactly.
I was just going to add to expand on that a little bit, because I think it's there's a lot of facets to this question, and so it's a little unclear which facets we're pointing to or might be alluded to in that question. But also that just to add that there isn't necessarily a single final CEFF recommendation hydrograph that could come out. There are ranges to the ecological flow criteria that sort of result from the CEFF process, used in a variety of ways. You could break it out by water year type. You could have different recommendations for different water years. And that natural variability that Julie's talking about is, we want to keep that incorporated into, that's part of the functionality of functional flows. And so it's not quite a cut and dry question to just say, here's a single hydrograph that's being recommended, and then comparing that to a single unimpaired hydrograph per se. So just adding that it's a bit of a nuanced question that actually would probably be very interesting for this group to discuss in more detail, perhaps as one of our future topics.
Okay, it looks like in case people didn't see it, that Robert put the link to the website up for the flow criteria reports. See, do we have any other questions or updates from anybody? Okay, how about, does anyone have any potential topics they would like to hear at our next meeting or an upcoming meeting? All right, so I'm not hearing any at this time, but
well,
you
Dan,
can always send me. Yeah.
It seems like a natural topic for, well, we're using that word natural too much. A logical topic perhaps for the next meeting would be some discussion of the feedback on the CEFF. Given that'll be kind of on the heels of that feedback coming in, and potentially there's been some time to digest it.
Yeah, we can definitely include that on the agenda, both the feedback and our recommended changes.
Sorry about
might
that.
have been yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just actually had more of a general question, and I apologize I missed that opportunity before, but just wondering if there's any thought about trying to use any of the CEFF tools or data from the TNC's natural stream flows database to better inform the current designation of stream intermittency in the state. You know, the NHD stream layer that primarily gets used for that, as many of us know, is not super accurate or up to date. And I was just wondering if there was any thought about trying to use any of these products to reclassify or better inform those designations, because I know they do get used quite often. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, this is Julie with TNC. So we, as part of the flow modeling, so there's two data sets on the natural flows database. There's the monthly natural flow predictions that we worked on with USGS and with TED kind of prior to the CEFF work. And then now there's the functional flow metric predictions up there. And one thing we tried to do was to model zero flow days, and it didn't work very well. But Darren Carlisle with USGS, who did all of this modeling with us, has been working on some ways to look at the probability of zero flow. And so that's something that we could maybe address in the future, but we haven't done any work on that right now.
Yeah, and Elijah, this is Eric. Just to expand on what Julie said, there's been a couple of efforts in Southern California where obviously this topic has a lot of implications, where several of the regional boards have taken the modeling approach that Darren has developed, that Julie was just talking about, and attempted to pilot test it. So some work was done in the San Diego region to look at, can you predict, different types of kind of flow duration. And it was really done more looking at, wet, dry years and then certain index months. So sort of probability of flow during May, during August, during, October, for example, in different water year types. And so you get sort of almost like a matrix of, probabilities of flow in different months and different water year types. So that's probably the thing, what I'm most familiar with in terms of trying to take some of the tools that USGS and Darren Carlisle have developed and implement them in kind of more of a local application. So I can follow up with you offline on that.
Yeah, I might pester you to try to find any report or anything kind of describing that process you were just talking about. But thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay, it looks like in chat we had another recommendation for next meeting or when they're ready, and that's pilot project presentation. And then one more question. In recommending the implementation of CEFF, how reflective would they be of the current meteorology or hydrology in terms of time and magnitude?
I can take that one. This is Ted Grantham again. So I guess in terms of the environmental flow recommendations that came out of CEFF, they would be reflective of the sort of contemporary hydrologic and meteorological conditions. So they're not, even when we say, even if we use, say, the natural functional flows to develop, criteria and ultimately recommendations for environmental flows, they would not be based on historical conditions, but current conditions. But in terms of actual implementation, I think, we're really advising, and we don't, again, provide a lot of detail, but really advising this would be done in an adaptive framework where, these recommendations, as these recommendations are implemented, we'd be looking to ensure that we're achieving the desired, ecological outcomes that these flows are intending to support. And so in that case, we would, certainly, it makes a lot of sense to have these recommendations be implemented in a way that would allow for some modification over time in response to, observed ecological outcomes and or changing, environmental conditions.
And also to add in that one, this is Sam Sandoval from UC Davis. We do our estimating some of the functional flow metrics and how they are changing, considering climate change. This is a project that we've been working for about a year or so. Still on progress, so coming soon, and it is only for the Sacramento. This project for a specific basin, we're also kind of working, collaborating with DWR. So that when it is coming, I think it will be part of the adaptive management update also, but yeah, we're exploring it. It's on the radar. It is not finished or ready for prime time. Thanks.
Yeah, Ted and Sam, this is Wansong again. The elaborate that question was how reflective of the flow regime or recommendation would it be for the say like the hydrology of this time, or the more of a forecast-based implementation. So it's like for this year, even though the recommended functional flow will be happening at certain time, recommended for the certain period of time, but if the rainfall event doesn't happen until anytime sooner or later, how would you implement, or how would you incorporate that aspect of it, or the current day weather event that be included in this CEFF recommendation? Okay, that was my question. So it was confusing. Sorry.
No, it's okay. And I guess I sort of have two responses. Well, first, the way that we've sort of formulated this process is that we anticipate that recommendations would be we would distinguish sort of the target values by water year type. So that's part of the answer, I guess, is that we would have targets for wet, moderate, and dry water year types. In terms of having a target and being able to in sort of near real time manage for these functional flows, it's really going to depend a lot on your management circumstances. I mean, if we're talking about managing functional flows in a highly regulated river, where we're really talking about reservoir reoperation, that opens up sort of one suite of tools. If we're talking about an unregulated river, such on the North Coast, when we're talking about basically the regulation of diversions, we would have to use a different suite of tools. One concept that's been sort of floated that could open up sort of opportunities for flexibility was a sort of a water budget or block of water approach that's been sort of being explored as part of the voluntary agreement process, and it's been discussed and worked by Public Policy Institute of California. And I think ideally there would be some ability to flexibly manage these functional flows, but that's not, that sort of level of detail around implementation is not addressed within the framework, and is really going to need to be developed on a watershed or project specific basis.
Maybe a part of the recommendation at a later time.
What's that?
Could it be as a part of the recommendation at the conclusion, or at the final SAP report for that focus based? I know that there's some places that does use the focus-based operation for the reservoirs, and then this could be, actually implementing this functional flow would be a part of that, I assume. But I know it's a difficult thing to manage for both recommending this functional flows, and then also if that's the case, you have to also incorporate the management of reservoirs and some other
yeah, I mean, I think those details would ultimately be provided in sort of the implementation plan that we sort of provide sort of the general sort of contours for, that we, you know, elements that we would expect to be included in an implementation plan, but we don't, you know, get into the level of detail given, yeah, sort of the diversity of of context in which we're trying to address.
I'll try this again. I would just add on the implementation side, as far as how, like an example of how you would implement a in-stream flow requirement that would depend on variability in the system of when precipitation comes and stuff like that. It would be our cannabis online mapping tool. And I'm not sure if folks are familiar with it. I can put the link in here. But basically, we made a tool that for cannabis cultivators that they can go online and click on their location, and it tells them whether or not there's water available for them to divert that day. That's the idea here as well, is that so their diversion season is from November 1st through March 31st. And between the dates of November 1st and December 15th, they can only divert water if the flow requirement is met for 7 continuous days. And so it also calculates that for them. It's a pretty slick tool that you can explore a little bit. But that's just kind of getting at the question of what's currently happening with precipitation and managing it more in real time once you get through that implementation phase. Okay, do we have any other last call for questions, comments? I'm hearing none. Main action item for everybody is to, we'll send the LIRIS email out on Friday when the documents are ready for review. So please go take a look and submit any comments or questions you may have so that we can circle back with those at the next meeting. And if any agenda topics or other agenda topics or anything else comes up between now and then, just shoot me an email and we can try to incorporate it. Okay, thank you, everybody. The meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.